Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I am very excited to continue season 10 today with our guest, Roy Baumeister. He is one of the world's most influential psychologists, best known for his groundbreaking research on the self, identity, self-control, and the search for meaning. Over his career, he has authored more than 700 publications and nearly 40 books, including Willpower, The Cultural Animal, and Meanings of Life. His work has reshaped how we understand human motivation, from passion and pleasure to the ways people find awe, purpose, and connection. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland and has held positions at Case Western Reserve, Florida State University, and Stanford Center for Advanced Study. How are you doing today?
Today's fine.
It's been really nice. I feel like I'm really excited to kind of get into today's conversation. You're calling out of Utah. What have you been doing up there?
Well, I've just been doing my work on various projects. I've started a new Substack that people can follow for free, and I've got scientific journal articles. Finished a book recently, and getting started perhaps on another one.
Yeah, that's exciting. You feel like do you live like in a city, or you live more in like the woods, which help you write a little better, or what?
Oh, we live up in the mountains.
Yeah.
My wife is a professor at Brigham Young University. But for health reasons, she wants to live up above because sometimes the air gets bad down in the valley.
I feel like what do you think it is about about nature and trees in specific, that because I feel that I've been writing a little bit more recently, and it's just fascinating because the second I end up just around some trees for a little bit, I feel like I have all these ideas. I really want to sit down and start writing, but I sometimes don't have that same motivation when I'm just in cities that are really loud. What you feel that? Do you feel that way? And if so, what do you think it is about those landscapes that bring that out?
I've always tried to do my writing in a place with a nice view of nature, um, and it's soothing and comforting. And I think being sort of quiet and peaceful, it encourages you to do your own thinking and so on. If you're in the middle of a big city, which can be exciting in other ways, but it's more distracting. And probably for evolutionary reasons, nature feels good at a deep conscious and probably unconscious level. So that may help, but it's just nice to have something pleasant to look at while you're working.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's something I've always thought about. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that. Where when I was in policy school, a lot of the classwork was so separated from the rest of the society. So people would talk about homelessness, for example, but live in areas where they would never have to actually encounter what it was that they were talking or theorizing about.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm curious if that separation, when we think about things or write about things, actually separate us from the people that we're writing about or the concepts that we're thinking about, as opposed to connecting us to them, you know?
That could be but somebody could write about homelessness based on data and information without actually seeing homeless people outside.
Hmm.
I suppose it
Yeah.
makes it more personal, but to have the phenomenon right there. But whether that improves or degrades your knowledge and objectivity could go either way.
Do you have a personal kind of opinion on that? Which way it might go?
No, I mean, I could see actually both effects. That if homeless people are interfering with your home life, blocking your entrance and things like that, you could develop negative feelings that could bias you. On the other hand, regular contact might give you some insights into what it's actually like for those people that would be harder to get just from a bunch of statistical analyses.
Hmm. I mean, I'm really excited to get into today's conversation because you write about human motivation, you write about willpower. I'm curious first what your backstory is. How did you kind of find yourself interested in those spaces and working in psychology? Or yeah.
Oh, well, I'm something of a generalist. I've always been interested in the big questions about human life. I thought for a while of being a philosophy major because that's supposedly the discipline that grapples with those. Instead, I went into psychology, but you can tackle a lot of the same questions using data, using information. Philosophers mainly think very carefully, whereas psychologists are not so careful in our thinking usually. But we have plenty of information to lead us to some conclusions or others.
Hmm. And, I mean, was there something that you feel like? I just think it's fascinating. Do you feel like questions about meaning is something I've noticed, I think, differ significantly from age group to age group, culture to culture, and even religious backgrounds and things like that? Do you feel like there were certain influences that helped you or made you think about those things?
Uh, I don't know if you were referring to first going into psychology or specifically getting into the topic of meaning, which I didn't do for a while. I'd written my first book on self and identity, which was a common concern of both ordinary people and scholars back in the 70s and 80s. And so I thought, well, this could really work. And so I set out to write my second book on meaning of life, just to say, not to think myself what is going to be the meaning of life, but rather what can we find from evidence about what makes people happy, uh, what goes on in their minds when they change the direction of their life in some fundamental way. Why do family and work loom so large in people's accounts? So I got started at that point on meaning. That turned out to be a much bigger project than I'd expected, and I ended up writing a couple other books that were shorter and quicker to finish before that one finally came out. Nevertheless, that first Meanings of Life book, I think it's my most cited book in terms of how often other scholars have mentioned it in their scientific publications. It's up around 4,000 other uh, publications have mentioned that book in their work, and that's awfully good. I mean, Google Scholar rates every scientist on whether you how many articles have you gotten to 10, 10 citations. So 10 is what they consider success. Getting to 100 is quite unusual after that, and getting to several thousand. So it did, I think, strike a nerve, get a lot of people going. One thing is, I'm considering whether to do a second book on it now. So there was very little research directly on that topic at a time. I had to really scramble and look around to find out enough evidence. But now there are lots and lots of studies showing what correlates. There are nice measures of how much people find their life meaningful or not, and looking at what correlates with that and what goes into it. So there'd be a lot more information now, which makes the job easier in one sense, I suppose harder in another. But if the goal is to tackle the problem based on data, there are a lot more data now. So I'm
Hmm.
visiting it.
What do you think caused that shift? What is there a particular reason people weren't looking at into meaning for so long and it shifted recently?
Yeah, well, in the history of psychology, if you go back to the middle of the 20th century, behaviorism really dominated the research fields in psychology, and they didn't want to talk about meaning or things that you couldn't see and measure objectively. So you had to always focus on absolute behavior, and that was the strong norm in, say, the 50s and into the 60s when I was getting my training in the 70s. That was just starting to break down. But even then, like if you wanted to study emotion, you had to say it was emotion behavior, sort of to pay homage to the idea that everything was still about behavior. So something as intangible as the meaning of life, the behaviorists, and remember, most of them were doing their research with rats. So the idea of finding out from a rat
Mm.
what's the meaning of its life would be silly. Um, but it was when social psychology got going and said, well, we're much more complicated than rats, and we can't just look at the actual behavior. We have to start going on what's happening inside the mind. And then the way psychologists think about meaning made it elusive. Um, and people hadn't come around to come up with tools. There's the pioneer Viktor Frankl, who had written kind of a clinical book about meaning and founded therapy that we can help people to move toward more meaningful lives. But the researchers hadn't really picked it up. But um, partly it may have been when my book came out, and so here was I, known as a lab researcher in that, and saying, well, this is a legitimate topic for scientific study. That might have encouraged some other people, or they might have just come up with it on their own by coincidence. So people started coming up with ideas and theories and measures. We forget how much of scientific progress is driven not by people's ideas, but by the methods. So if you wanted to study what predicts whether people say their life is highly meaningful or not so meaningful, you didn't really have a basis for doing it. But as I said, there's several good scales that were developed around the turn of the century that enabled researchers to start collecting data and making progress that way. So I'm happy to see
Mm.
it. What exactly brought about the change, I'm not sure. There's a real, in the history of social psychology, when I was in graduate school in the late 70s, it was very narrowly focused on a few issues. Partly it was still in hoc to behaviorism. And it was in the 80s it really opened up to say we got to study all kinds of different topics, and we need a range of different methods. And so it became a very intellectually exciting field to work in. And so nothing was off limits. And of course, if some people find life meaningful and others don't, that might be meaningful. That might produce differences in their behaviors and their thoughts and feelings. And so these would be something to explore. So it became on the table as something people could do. And then when the methods start coming along, then people started doing more work on it. And so that was a real exciting phase for social psychology, the late 20th century, going into the beginning of this century. It's closed down so much recently over a lot of concern about methods and
Mm.
and things like that. I mean, there are always phases. It's good for science to focus on methods, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping it can get back to a more engagement with ideas and off the methodological self-criticism.
Hmm. I mean, I'm really curious to get into these methods because I think because I think a lot of this particular conversation has deep implications on education as well, where it often feels like because some things can't be measured, they seem to just be like pushed off to the side, and we focus on things that can be measured, and so it's easier to implement policy around that and things like that. But I'm curious first to kind of even get into what would some of the methods in studying meaning even look like?
Well, there are two basic scientific approaches. One is to measure it. So you can give people a questionnaire, even with fairly simple questions like, would you say your life is very meaningful on a 11-point scale from not at all meaningful to extremely meaningful? Um, I'm not totally enamored of that. It seems a rather simplistic approach, but why not start simple? And certainly the people who say yes versus the people who say no, or the people who give themselves, say, a 9 out of 11 versus people who give themselves 5 out of 11. Um, that might be something you could explore. The other approach would be to manipulate it. That's the more experimental approach. It's hard to change the meaning of someone's life in the laboratory, but you can get them to think about things in a highly meaningful way, or get them to reflect on their life and how it lacks meaning, and sort of at least create a mindset, so that you have two groups of people that one is thinking their life is highly meaningful and the other is not, and then you can look for consequences of that. The differences are probably not going to be as big as when you measure people's actual feelings about their lives. But it has the advantage of being an experiment, so you can really test causal questions as to what causes what. For example, people say their life is not meaningful if they have higher rates of depression, which is also be a questionnaire you give them. So then you'd wonder, well, is the depression causing them to see life as meaningless? Or is it the perception that life is meaningless that makes them depressed? Either is plausible. It could be both. Could be neither, that something else causes both. So the advantage is the experimental method. But in the social sciences, no method is perfect. We need all the different methods. And someone who's read lots of and written lots of summaries of research in many different areas, I always come back to convergence across multiple methods is the best confidence we can get in any sort of conclusion. Again, there's no perfect method, so I look for multiple different methods pointing towards the same conclusions.
Yeah. I'm curious, in your book, you said it was called Meaning of Life, right?
Meanings, plural.
Yeah. Oh, Meanings of Life, is that what you said? Yeah. What did you feel like was the novel idea that caused it to be cited so much?
Well, that I don't know. I did treat it as a scientific problem, and that might have been enough. As I said, there had been a sort of taboo against studying anything like that, and um, the professors who taught me would have discouraged me from tackling a topic like that. So perhaps just saying this is something we can address and study scientifically, maybe that gave people enough encouragement. Um, I did come up with the conclusion that there's more consistency in the questions than the answers. That what is it that people are looking for when they want meaning? Well, I came up with a list of 4 things. There's purpose, so the present draws meaning from the future, and you're orienting toward trying to move toward some goal or some state of fulfillment, like getting to heaven or whatever. Um, and then values, you have to have some idea of what's good and bad and some basis for thinking of yourself as a good person. Otherwise, life is not so meaningful. And then a sense of efficacy, that it's not just enough to have good goals, but you have to feel that you can move toward them, that you can make a difference in the world, that you can get something done. And last, a sense of self-worth, that the others add up, that you are somewhat a meaningful, a valuable person. In practice, it often seems to mean people want to think have some base for thinking they're better than other people. um, so I thought, how people satisfy these, they can satisfy it in very different ways. You can get efficacy from writing a book or winning a tennis tournament or raising a child or running a restaurant. There are lots of different ways, but the need to have some purpose and consider it a positive one and to think you can get there, those seem to be the constant aspects. So other people have come up with slightly different frameworks, but it's fairly similar. So again, just trying to frame it as a scientific problem may have gotten people going on that.
Hmm. I mean, I think I always love lists, and I love I really appreciated these four. I think something that's been really fascinating for meaning specifically for me is it wasn't a thing that I had ever, the environments that I grew up in, the culture that I came from, it was interesting because I had never even heard the word meaning growing up. It was not a thing that I'd ever even thought about until I took my first existentialism class, my last quarter before leaving undergrad. And that was the first time I feel like I directly confronted this question of what is my meaning? What does it even mean to, am I supposed to have one? What is that? All those questions really only started at that point, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Same with these words like purpose. I feel like oftentimes those words actually allow for a whole new form of living that before you've even heard that word, you might not have even thought about it. And I always find that to be a really fascinating relationship with some of these concepts and themes. How do you feel like that actually ends up playing a role in meaning? Like, for example, if I grew up in a way where no one ever talked about meaning, it wasn't a thing, I might not even think, is my life meaningful? I might just feel like my life is, where once you see the word, you start thinking, now you start feeling like, oh, I need to question this. Is my life meaningful?
Yes, well, certainly there are many people who have lived long and happy or unhappy lives without really worrying about what it all means. Uh, it is it is something that the human mind, when it has time to reflect on things, does at some point get around to, but it's certainly not obligatory to concern about this. Remember, through much of history, a lot of people were very poor, farming to try to grow enough food to feed themselves and their families and maybe produce a small surplus. Um, so pondering the meaning of life may not have been an issue for that. And of course, also, many people have been staunchly religious, which explain to them these ultimate questions of why are we here and what should we be doing in life and what happens when we die. Um, Different religions have slightly different answers to those questions, but if you live in a community where pretty much everyone shares the same religion, again, that was the normal experience through much of history, um, then, well, that's the answer. It seems objectively true. As I think Peter Berger wrote back, a scholar, a sociologist of religion, that religion becomes much more plausible when everybody agrees with it. It just seems to be part of the objective world, um, like the weather or the change of the seasons and so on. So you don't really start to question it now when you live in a complex environment like the United States, where there are lots of different religions and lots of people are not religious. And lots of people who say they're religious but don't ever do anything about it except maybe go to church twice a year. Um, then you're exposed to all different views and go to university, which more atheists at universities than elsewhere, and people challenging the very notions of it and depicting religion as some kind of ideological manipulation rather than the simple fact of how the universe is set up. That will also push people to question and perhaps form new and novel opinions. You mentioned existentialism. I think it's no accident that it came to prominence in the early 20th century when many intellectuals were turning away from religion and trying to take a fresh look of why are we here and what are we doing and what are we supposed to be doing. Um, if they stop saying, well, our job here is to do what God told us to do, um, then that raises the question, okay, if there's no God telling us what to do, then what are we supposed to do? So that was an important chapter, but again, it would be hard to see those same ideas emerging 300 years earlier when everyone, certainly in in Europe and even in the colonies here in the North America, pretty much everyone was either a Christian or I guess there were a few Jews, and the Christians were mainly split among the two big camps, Catholic and
I guess I'm really, I want to kind of expand a little bit more on your breakdown of purpose, values, efficacy, and self-worth, because something that I'm curious about is, let's say I'm able to, I have plants. Let's just say hypothetically, I have plants I really care about, and I want to water them. That helps me develop some sort of ethical system of what I should and shouldn't be doing. I do it well, and I feel like I'm capable of doing it. But what if, even though I do all that, I still feel like none of this matters? The plants don't matter. I don't matter. I just do it because it makes me feel good. That could just the same, those four things could still lead me to a state where I just value pleasure rather than where I value meaning.
yes, well, pleasure is always with us, or at least as a concern. Yeah, it's pretty basic. Certainly, it's much more basic in evolution than meaning. As I mentioned, the rats, they probably don't ever think about the meaning of life. They're very sensitive to pleasure and pain. So our minds evolved from these simpler animal minds where pleasure and pain were major drivers. In terms of watering the plants, well, certainly taking care of them will give you a sense of meaningfulness of life. Now, whether that's enough, um, that's a hard question, and you can apply the same thing. Uh, People who have children look at raising children as one of the most meaningful things they did, and people late in life looking back on their lives, often raising children they see as one of the most meaningful things they did. But you can make the same argument. Just as your plants don't matter, why do your children matter? Isn't it just kind of passing the buck? The meaning of my life was to produce these children. Well, why is that meaningful? What's the meaning of their life? Well, they're going to produce more children. It's sort of almost a Ponzi scheme or something that.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it does feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, at some point the sun will blow up and our species will cease to exist if we make it that long, which I doubt. But um, so then what? It will all have been for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're asking me? I
I'm just raising the sort of rhetorical.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think I've heard, so 2 seasons ago we talked specifically about meaning, and a lot of people pointed towards something that exists in essence through aesthetic experiences or through art, that kind of, to some extent, aims to capture that tension of none of this is none of this is meaningful, yet there is this deep desire for meaning that exists within all of us that causes us to create and do all the things that we do. And there's like a leap of faith that has to happen because I think meaning is, for me at least, I believe meaning is one of those things that you can never arrive at rationally. And so there's always going to be a leap of faith where you wake up and you feel like your sports teams matter, and you feel like, whatever it is that helps someone wake up in the morning and get onto their day. I feel like there's always a leap of faith in that thing matters. And I have found this to be really interesting because a lot of my students and students that I've just worked with, when you ask them questions of like, what do you care about? It's been really fascinating to see how many students will often respond with, I don't know, I've never been asked that question. Where it's been quite shocking to see that, where the first time you ask them, what is it that you care about? There's all of a sudden this like deep realization that they've never really asked that question or have been asked that question. It's always what someone else cares or what someone else has told you matters, and then you just copy that and you live it through. But to really question that can be so challenging, and I think it often can open up doors that you might not be ready to go through yet. So I guess my first question for you is, like, thinking about meaning to me seems like something that needs to be practiced. It can't just be thrown at you one day where all of a sudden you're like, I don't have the tools to deal with this, and now I'm feeling nihilistic, or whatever comes out of that. In the way that you've taught about it, or written about it, how do you think you can start these conversations, perhaps at a younger age, where it may not be extremely overwhelming, and you're developing the tools to really contend with the fact that maybe your life, whatever you thought mattered, maybe doesn't matter?
Well, it seems a hard lesson to lay on a young person, but at some age, I think, well, one has to face up to those questions. First thing, um, well, whether the first is what's good and bad, um, um, you have to have some sense of that. But so meaning connects across time. That's one of the important things, and that's one thing that sets us human beings apart from just about all the other animals. They don't really have much of an awareness of time. Um, they carry with them lessons they learned in the past, but there's a serious debate about whether they can remember a past experience the way we do, whether we can replay it in our minds. And it turns out we don't really replay it in our minds anyway. We reconstruct what had happened. I remember Julian Jaynes talking about this in his work on consciousness. And one exercise he had to remember the last time you went swimming. And so people have to think, yeah, okay. And it turns out for a lot of them, the scene of themselves swimming is not the way they actually experienced it, of their face in the water, but it's sort of viewed from overhead. You remember, okay, well, that would have been 2 months ago. I went to the pool here and swam. So they picture the pool and they picture themselves swimming in it, which is obviously a reconstruction of the past. It's not a memory for how you actually experienced it. Anyway, it's unclear that other animals can do that. And in terms of the future, they have short-term expectancies, a few seconds, um, maybe a few minutes. The smartest animals on a couple really important things can maybe think 15 or 20 minutes ahead into the future, but that's it. It's nothing like human life where we make plans weeks in advance and make plans for where you're going to go on vacation next summer, or where you want your career to be, or you go to university, not on a day-to-day basis, but because you expect to spend a certain number of years there and achieve something. So acquiring this sense of yourself that the present is just a moment in the story, that's a coherent story connecting the past and the future based on what you're doing now, that really moves us into a much more meaningful kind of life than we would see among our animal relatives.
Hmm. What about our ability to, do some animals have the ability to remember far back into the past?
Well, it's hard to know, but uh, there's plenty of skepticism there that they can replay it, that they don't have that ability to reproduce things. Maybe when they're dreaming, they seem to have dreams of chasing and so forth. Whether they're remembering a specific experience or sort of making one up at that time is very hard to say, because they don't talk. We can't really interview them. Um, but in terms of solid evidence that they can remember a particular previous experience, or they do something, they get punished for it, they remember not to do that.
Hmm.
Or let's see, I've had several dogs, and occasionally they chase a skunk and get sprayed with a skunk. One of them learned just from that, and as soon as there was any skunk in the vicinity, he hid. Now, whether he was remembering the previous experience or just get the lesson that skunk smell is a disaster, avoided at all costs. It's painful, unpleasant itself, and plus it means getting lots of baths, which this particular dog hated, which most dogs do. But other dogs never learned, or would continue to chase him and continue to get sprayed. Um, So, um,
Yeah. I
so
mean,
learning is there, but it may be just learn that smell is bad and go and hide and be careful. That could be the lesson that survived. Not that, oh, I remember that day on a July afternoon. I
yeah.
was out in the woods and there was a skunk there, and I don't know that they can remember that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find that to be super fascinating, the difference between, for a human, the ability to intellectualize something versus when it actually becomes embodied and it's something you no longer need to think about. I mean, riding a bicycle, I think it's a great example where there's a point where you stop thinking about riding a bicycle and you just do it, or walking or brushing your teeth. But then when you talk to people who've, forgotten those things or have had parts of their brains damaged for whatever reason and then have to relearn it, it becomes intellectual again, where you have to think through every step of it. And it's so fascinating how that happens for us. And that I know I guess I just don't know the process in which that happens, but I'm assuming the dog being afraid of the skunk probably is not happening at the intellectual level, but it's just part of their body where they're like, that was so disgusting, I don't even want to experience that, but they're not like thinking about it.
Right. I suspect that's right. Thinking is quite limited in dogs.
Yeah. And something I was writing down when we were talking earlier about meaning is, and I guess asking this more personally and just how our research impacts your life. And it's, do you feel like when I say something is meaningful, does that mean that this is meaningful to me and it matters to me, or or when someone says this has meaning, is that more on an objective scale? Is it possible to just have subjective personal meaning, or does all meaning have to be objective in some sense?
Well, it's a complicated question. I mean, certainly different. The same thing will have different meanings for different people. So there is a lot of subjective meaning. Now, I think Heidegger said there's nothing truly private. You can just have sort of a secret collection of things taken from the public realm. And so ideas are out there for everyone, and whether a particular idea appeals to you or not might depend on your circumstances and experiences. So it'll be different from someone else's, but there is a sense of in which meaning exists subjectively. Like example, I use the system of numbers and arithmetic. Um, that's pure meaning. Uh, Say that 9 times 7 equals 25, that's false. So the falseness of that is not a physical thing, uh, but it's an objective truth. Every culture, even though it may have discovered arithmetic on its own, every culture gets the same answer. 9 times 7 is 25 is always wrong. So there's something objective out there that the individual mind can learn. We learn it from our culture. We learn arithmetic facts and so on. Um, so what goes on in the individual mind is essentially borrowed from this objective public sphere, but it certainly can be highly personal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how do you feel like your research has influenced your own way of finding meaning or moving through the world meaningfully?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not one of those people whose psychology research is driven by trying to understand myself or solve my own problems or anything like that. Um, I'm actually more interested in people who are different from me and what it's like to be them. Like I had on papers on guilt or on binge eating or on suicide and so on. These had no personal relevance to me, but I just wondered what goes on, what it's like to be a person in that state. Um, so I can't really point to a lot of specific changes in my own life.
Mm. But when you're looking at meaning, are you mainly just fascinated by how people derive meaning in their own lives? Or the impact meaning then plays in other aspects.
I'm not sure what the difference is. Um, of course, how people find meaning or fail to find meaning in their own lives, that's one of the basic psychology questions in the whole area of doing research on meaning. So those are important and central. I didn't understand what the alternative was.
The alternative, I think you had mentioned earlier, where you were like somebody who might find meaning that could affect whether they experience depression or not, where one causes the other.
Right. Yeah, and it could go either way or both or neither. Um, so, well, those are interesting questions too. Um, that's why it takes a whole book to
Yeah.
problem of meaning.
Have you worked with clients or people who, particularly in regards to finding meaning?
I don't do therapy. I'm
Mm,
not a clinician. I have no training or background in that. It's a purely research career.
mm, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think meaning is just it's so fascinating, and it's something I keep in the back of my mind as I navigate through a lot of this work, and really questioning even in terms of the ways in which we build education are all built after really contending with some of these questions, really thinking about what is a meaningful life, and then implementing that in some ways into these schooling systems. And I think one thing I wanted to just touch on briefly is mainly on passion and awe, which seem to be. Do you feel like, first of all, I mean, do you feel like passion? Because you talked about purpose, values, efficacy, self worth, and then the three things that I thought were pleasure, awe, and passion, which also seem to be these like deep experiences that I don't know, make a life very worthwhile. Do you feel like those are also parts of that? Those four?
Well, let me start with passion. That would usually be connected with some purpose and with the value that something is really good or bad, and so something needs to be done about it. And if you're passionate enough, you get involved and do something about it. So efficacy becomes important, and working passionately on something then can end up making you feel self worth. Awe is a trickier one. It's more a sense of one's own smallness in the vast universe, or marveling at the beauty or something out there. I don't know that outside of a religious context would really contribute to feelings of meaningfulness. But we do know that intense experiences of awe, whether it's delivered or caused by religious awakening or by taking psychedelic drugs, um, gives an intense feeling that something is very important and meaningful and that it matters. Um, I mean, there used to be jokes among researchers about on LSD that it would invest trivial things in with seemingly immense meaning. Is the one about Diane acid being struck in the men's room with the profundity of the sign that said, "Please flush after using." Uh, Thought that was a key insight into life or something like that. Um, so, and this brings us to a somewhat disturbing idea: is meaningfulness more a thought or a feeling? Um, People will describe experiences as meaningful or meaningless, and if it's meaningful in the cognitive sense, they should be able to explain exactly what it means and why it's meaningful and all that. But if it's more of a feeling, then then I don't know. Then so meaningfulness as an emotion is something that needs to be understood better. So a meaningful relationship would be full of lots of feelings, but what makes it meaningful is there some connection to the future, and especially a meaningful experience. It just gives you the sense of awe, or of that there's something big and important there, even if you don't know what it is. I said passion, awe. What was the third one?
And pleasure.
Pleasure. Well, okay. Well, pleasure again is much more basic and much earlier in evolution. Simple minds probably started to get pleasure from doing things that contributed to survival and reproduction. There's pleasure from eating food, from getting a good night's sleep, from having great sex. Lots of
Mm,
animals will have those without needing to elaborate it in terms of meaningfulness. Now, the human mind, we do have meaning, so those basic things get transformed and become much more meaningful. So we have ceremonial dinners, or state dinners, or celebratory dinners. We have table manners. We have all sorts of things. So the basic animal act of consuming food for nutrition gets reinvented and transformed. The animal core is still there. The pleasure of getting food into your body so that you don't starve and die. That's still there. But we burden it with lots of cultural rituals and symbols and meanings too. Certainly the same goes for sex. I mean, lots of animals have sex without ever having to talk about it, but look at how much people talk about sex, uh, exploring the meaningfulness of it and different meanings and so on.
do you- Similar to um, I guess I know it's not evidence based, but Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, I'm curious if similarly pleasure comes first, and then people start thinking about, I don't know, ethical, how ethical their actions are, and then maybe they move on to how purposeful they are, and then eventually you get to meaning. You think it's something like that?
Um, okay, Maslow's hierarchy. The research doesn't support it as a
Yeah.
hierarchy. They don't. People go through them in that sequence. I think he may have been right that when you don't have enough to eat, that takes precedence over some other concerns because it's more urgent. Um, but some people will pursue self-actualization. Let's give an example of the starving artist who hasn't solved the more basic ones, but really is passionate about painting or singing or whatever the artwork is. Nevertheless, it's also useful as a typology of different motivations that people certainly have, um, and there could be meaning in each of them. Self-actualization was his highest level, supposedly, and that's never been really well understood. It's one of those things that everybody wants, but nobody knows quite what it is. The more basic ones, and I presume it would bring pleasure if you feel like you're fulfilling your potential and doing great. That must be satisfying in a way. But certainly, pleasure comes at all the lower ones. You get pleasure from food and safety and all those things. You get pleasure from belonging and being accepted by others, um, being esteemed. So um, pleasure can come in at multiple places. The capacity for pleasure was I think, pretty early appearing in evolution. Once you have brains, at least, it's not clear that plants have pleasure, but creatures with brains feel pleasure and pain. One of my things I've learned in my research is bad things have more impact than good things. So I would guess the earliest conscious experience in very simple animal was pain, because it's a signal that the body is being damaged. So you need to do something to stop the damage immediately. But pleasure, uh, very, again, closely tied to things that increase life, either by making you survive or making you reproduce and produce another life.
Hmm. I guess, to maybe wrap up the conversation, the final question I have for you is, as you think about writing this next book, what pieces do you feel like were not present in the last one? Are you thinking about expanding on this one?
Well, I don't want to give away all my ideas, but there are a number of things. First of all, in terms of those four basic needs, the one interesting addition since then is coherence, the idea that a life is more meaningful if the different parts fit together, and that goes with that story awareness. Um, so, I mean, some people, different chapters of their life have almost no connection to each other. You might have a job with this and a live-in lover and even a child, and then you break up and you move to another place and you get a different job and a new family, and the old family is just left behind or forgotten. So, in some ways, I would say that's less meaningful than a life where all the different parts fit together. Also intrigued by the idea that meaningfulness makes life more incomplete. It's partly the nature of meaning brings in alternatives. So, like, wet means you're not dry, or high means you're not low. And so, just by putting meaning on something, you're bringing in alternative possibilities. And so, the more meaningful your life, the more other possibilities there were that were not fulfilled, since we only live once and can only do one set of things. So, in a sense, the most meaningful lives will be also the ones with the greatest sense of incompleteness.
Mm.
That's a hypothesis. I don't know quite how to get data on that, but that would be something I would want to explore. Also, I think we need more research on meaninglessness. There are now plenty of studies of what makes things meaningful, but all the conceptual focus is on the high end of high meaning. So what contributes to life being more meaningful is that you have a good job and you have a family who loves you, and so on, or artistic contributions, or you're doing something that will last into the future. So the lack of meaning also, I think, needs to be explored, and how common that is, and what leaves people to feel that. I mean, remember, as I said, the questions are constant. So um, you could get meaning from lots of different ways. Meaninglessness seems to be more uniform, and that you'd have to have none of these, because if anything were meaningful, then then that would give your life meaning. So to be meaningless, um, it would have to be a lack of everything of that sort. So those are
Mm.
some of the ideas to explore.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to see it. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was a great conversation.
Okay, I've enjoyed it too. Thanks very much for having me, and I'll let you know the book will be a couple of years. It takes a long time to produce one like that.
Yeah. I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Season 10 is getting on its way. We're reaching towards the second half, but I hope you're enjoying the season so far. And as per usual, stay re educated.